question. We are going to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Adam Ash. I'm with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And as your technical host, I want to take a moment to address a couple of technical things to keep in mind as we move through this webinar. Again, this is the Substance Use Issues in Juvenile Court, an overview for prosecutors webinar. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted on our YouTube page. You can also check out prior webinars that we've hosted on our YouTube page. There's a ton of information that you may have interest in. If you're looking for supporting materials such as the transcript or other handouts that were presented as part of these webinars, you can obtain those by contacting the OJJDP TTA Help Desk at the email address on your screen. Couple webinar tips to keep in mind. We do have our handouts pod at the upper right-hand corner that has bios, that has resources that are related to our topic today and other important information. We also want to let you know that we do have our chat pod that's available for questions, and we do encourage you to enter your questions. We may not get to all of them, but we do certainly encourage you to ask those questions, as they will help inform future webinar topics. At this time, we ask if you're joining with somebody in a group that you enter in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. Again, if you're viewing this alone, there's no need to type anything into our chat pod at this time. We do want to mention that as an attendee today, you will receive a certificate of attendance. For those of you that are signed in, that'll come through to you automatically shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. However, if you're in a group and the group attendees are in need of a certificate, we do ask you to download the group validation form, complete that, sign that, and send it to us, and we'll get the group attendees a certificate as well. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter, Susan Broderick with the National District Attorneys Association. Again, thank you for joining us, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute honor and delight to be with you today. My name is Susan Broderick. I'm a senior attorney with the National District Attorneys Association. And to give you a little bit of my background, I started my career in 1989 in the Manhattan DA's office. Spent 14 years there. I handled everything from basic misdemeanors through to domestic violence, sex crimes, homicides. And when I left there, I was actually the deputy chief in charge of the child abuse cases. So I've handled kind of every single case you can, and in 2003 I moved to DC and took a position with the National DA's Association, where I started as a senior trial attorney dealing with child abuse cases, and in 2006 I decided to move over to juvenile justice. And one of those reasons was because I realized I had worked in the adult system, I worked in the child abuse system, and that in-between group, you know, the juvenile justice system to me seemed like the court of opportunity. So I've been working on juvenile justice issues since 2006. In 2008, I went over to Georgetown. I spent 10 years as an assistant research professor at Georgetown, worked on a lot of reform initiatives. I can tell you the one thing for sure that I am not is a professor. And even though it was my title there, I'm a prosecutor, and I will always be a prosecutor at heart. And so what that experience did give me, though, was a better understanding of the research and, you know, where it's important in our work, where it can be misinterpreted. And so that has been really helpful. So today, and then just recently, last October, actually, I came back to the National DA's Association, and I am working on a juvenile justice grant we have from OJJDP to help juvenile court prosecutors. So that's me, and in terms of today's presentation, we are going to go over a lot, so I'll try to get everything covered here. So what we're going to talk about today is recognizing the prevalence of substance use, misuse, and addiction with adolescents, understanding the science behind what leads to addiction, identifying key decision points and practices to prevent, intervene, and promote recovery for youth. Yeah. Substance use, misuse, and addiction. Now, something I didn't mention during my introduction, but is very key to the work that I do in this area, is that I am a woman in long-term recovery. And for me, that means I have not had a drink since July 15th, 2001. And growing up, I definitely, I misbehaved. I was a wild kid, but for the grace of God, I did not end up in the justice system, but I did, from a very early age, I drank alcoholically. And I came from a family where alcoholism, like, ran through the family tree. Like, our family tree was like a vineyard. And so that was something that I struggled with. And even when I became a prosecutor, I used the fact that I was a prosecutor to sort of deny my drinking problem, because I really couldn't imagine life without alcohol. But when I finally addressed my issue, I really got to experience some amazing things and realize that there's nothing to be ashamed about, because so much of this is a genetic condition, and the only thing I really could do was to turn my life away from substances. So anyway, I just wanted to share that perspective, because that has really helped me in terms of looking at the research, looking at best practices, and recognizing where, there's some research out there that, I don't know, I still question, and I know that sometimes findings can be manipulated, but then very often I'll find some research or science that just touches me, and it's like I know it to be true because I experienced it. And so much of what we're learning now in terms of addiction and recovery are things I've experienced firsthand. So again, I really am very passionate about trying to bring hope to this issue, and I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to do that right now. So, we really are truly in a unique moment in history. 2020, I mean, I don't even have to say that really, but, we were in the midst of an addiction crisis, and then we have this pandemic. And what I'm seeing now, and even within sobriety groups I attend and through the, stories I read in the media, is that the addiction crisis is actually worsening because people are scared, people are fearful, people are turning to alcohol and drugs to deal with some of this. And there's, they talk about addiction being a disease of isolation, and there's so much isolation right now. So that's the bad news. Okay, so, we got a lot going on right now, and again, you all know that. The good news is that there are some silver linings. And for those of you, I know that many of you are prosecutors on this call, and, as prosecutors, we deal with problems every day, but what we look for are the solutions. What we look for are opportunities to turn things around. So there are a lot of opportunities right now that we can tap into and use these opportunities to turn things around. So over the last 20 years, there has just been such an incredible increase in our understanding of adolescent brain development. We also learned so much about addiction and recovery. And a lot of this is because of advances that were made in neuroscience. and our better understanding of the brain. So that has impacted both adolescent development understanding and the understandings of addiction and recovery. There's also a momentous paradigm shift underway. And I've been sort of in the front row watching this happen. And slowly but surely, we're moving away from an acute care medical model that just really concentrates on treatment and moving into a recovery model. And here you'll see it's referred to as ROS. So it's a recovery-oriented system of care. And to me, when I first was introduced to the ROSC model, I just knew it made sense. And I knew it intuitively because I had experience. And I know that with the ROSC model, one of the things is it looks at our new understanding of addiction. We know that it's a potentially chronic issue, but just like other chronic issues, it's preventable, and the earlier the intervention, the better the prognosis. We also know that unlike other diseases, addiction and recovery don't just happen inside the body, and there's social and community aspects to both. So looking at all of those things really serves us very well, because these are incredible advances in our understanding of how to turn a life around. So when we look at substance use and the importance of addressing it in juvenile court, there's lots of reasons that we do this. The links between substance use and juvenile offending are well documented, and I have a couple of studies listed here. And the other thing that I'll note is I have put some of these in the handout box, and I've also posted them. We work with the New York Prosecutors Institute, and they have a prosecutor encyclopedia. Again, this is only available to prosecutors. So if you are a prosecutor and want access to these articles, you can send me an email, and my information will be at the end of this presentation, and you can access all of the articles that we talk about through the Prosecutor Encyclopedia. So anyway, these are some of the studies, and believe me, there's many more out there, but just again confirming substance use and juvenile offending and that mutual relationship that happens, the mutually reinforcing. And you'll see here that the middle study that I cited, this is more recent than the other two, but involvement in crime associated with alcohol or other drug use, and this relationship is mutually reinforcing with antisocial thoughts and deviant peer groups playing a key role. And again, when you think about it, this all makes sense. So it's sort of the real world and the research coming together to tell us what we know to be true. And the juvenile justice system in particular has a very important role to play, and it has the untapped potential to serve as a very early interception point and turning point for youth with substance use issues. As gatekeeper to the system, prosecutors really need to have a working knowledge of the research that's out there and the latest developments within the field. One of the things we know is that as a prosecutor or somebody, another stakeholder working in the justice system, you are going to face addiction. You're going to see it in your courts, in your cases, and sometimes it may not be just the offender or the youth that's charged. Sometimes it may be the victim. Sometimes it may be a witness. Sometimes, you don't know. So that's why it's really important that because this is not something we ever learned in law school, but it's something that we will be seeing every day pretty much in our professional life. The other thing that's important to consider is the role of the prosecutor. And it's really been evolving over the last several years. And we know there's been a lot of reform underway, which is important. And we also know that the numbers of cases being sent to court have been reduced significantly. So what this has resulted in is actually giving prosecutors more time to work on issues within their community where they can do it inside and outside of the courtroom. And, you know, understanding the nature of addiction can really provide prosecutors and other JJ professionals to more effectively respond and identify the problems earlier. And that's where I think, you know, one of the greatest takeaways I hope all of you get from today's presentation is just understanding the opportunities that exist right now to either prevent or intervene early, because those things are very possible in juvenile court. So let's just start out with a definition. This is the updated definition from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, ASAM. And it says, well, you can read along with me, addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use and other behaviors. If any of you have had experience with somebody who is suffering from an addiction, you'll probably notice the insanity of it, because despite the negative consequences, very often they just keep continuing engaging in behavior and taking alcohol or other drugs despite the consequences that are clearly there and have been there in the past. And that's what they talk about when it's pathologically pursuing. And again, I just mentioned this before, so it's really important to understand that addiction is preventable, but it's also potentially chronic and potentially deadly. And again, across the continuum, wherever you're working, you can be looking or considering each of these stages in terms of your intake procedures, in terms of dispositions that you're going to be recommending, because we can recognize that at every single point, every single interception point, or every single point of the system that you will be making decisions, that you can be looking at where that individual is and what you can be doing more effectively to make sure that they not only don't relapse, but they don't return to offending. This report was really groundbreaking, and it came out, it was released in November of 2016, and quite frankly, I think it is something that we should all have in our offices. Fortunately, well, now we can have it on our computer because you can access this report and download it, but it truly is a compilation of basically the research over the last 20 years and what we know and how much we've learned. And it looks at all the different factors. And again, you're going to hear me repeating prevention, early intervention, treatment, recovery. And it really is the first time that the Surgeon General tackled this issue. And what gave me a lot of hope is the recognition of what the last Surgeon General's report on smoking and the impact that that had on smoking in the United States. So I'm hopeful that this Surgeon General's report will provide the same incentive for people to learn more about how they can deal with this and either not get addicted or to resolve their addiction. And I do think it's such an incredible resource, and I have a link at the end of this so you can download it, but it's just chock full of material and great insights. So these are some of the major findings of the report. It talks about the devastating public health and safety consequences, including tolls on individuals, families, and communities. And it just, the role that alcohol plays in all types of crimes, including interpersonal violence, child abuse, neglect. And I know, I spent several years as a sex crimes prosecutor. So many of those cases involved, but usually alcohol, but drugs or alcohol. So again, this is something that has such an impact in the justice system that we need to understand how to best respond. One of the major messages from this report was the impact of alcohol, drugs, and young people, the impact that alcohol and drugs have on young people. And the earlier people try alcohol or drugs, the more likely they are to develop a disorder. In fact, people who first use alcohol before age 15 are 4 times more likely to become addicted to alcohol at some time in their lives. I wish somebody would have told me this, but then again, I was a very headstrong, rebellious 14-year-old, but it's one of the risk factors. And, again, this is something that we need to raise awareness on, because there's so many people who think, well, it's a harmless rite of passage, and this is what teenagers do, and, I did it when I was a teenager. Well, given what we've learned over the last 20 years in terms of the vulnerability of the developing adolescent brain, we can no longer say this is a harmless rite of passage. It may be a rite of passage, but it's very harmful, and that message needs to get out. We know that there's an overwhelming tendency for substance use to begin in adolescence and peak during young adulthood. And one of the recommendations from the Surgeon General and the experts that worked on this report was that one of the most significant things we can do is to prevent or delay young people from trying substances in the first place. And that's where I think using the information from this Surgeon General's report to really educate young people and let them see, because I think that so many of them think, especially and we're going to get into, marijuana and things like that, but they're like, everybody does it. And especially with marijuana, oh, they're legalizing it all over the country. Like, this is fine. And not being aware of the risk has been shown to create more use, increase use. So one of the things that we really have to do is get the message out there to the kids, to the parents, to the schools, to the judges, to the defense attorneys, everybody we can, because we need to smash the myth that it's a harmless rite of passage. So last week, actually, every year, now SAMHSA is the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and they do so much work in this area. I would also, if any of you are ever looking for more information specifically on particular drugs, impacts like that, SAMHSA is an incredible resource. So here's just the page, and the report that I'm talking about is actually here. It's the National Substance, what did I write? National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And as I said, this was just released last week. And so we have some good news and we have some bad news from this report. So the good news is, and as you'll see over here, opioid use disorders, those numbers are down. So that's good. We know that there's been a concerted effort to really address the opioid issue, and of course that's very, very important. So that's good news. Unfortunately, LSD use is up in all the age groups, but the most significant increase has been in youth between the ages of 12 and 17. So, a lot of times when we're talking about substance use and substance misuse and addiction, it's like we're playing whack-a-mole because, we can put all the focus on opioids and then, whoops, you look over and the numbers in LSD are going up and then meth problems are increasing. So, it's important to focus on particular drugs, but it's also more important to look at really the conditions that create the problem overall, because the type of drug is important, for some reasons, but overall we really need a basic and a better understanding of what causes addiction and how we can work to prevent it, intervene, and treat it, and provide recovery support. The other issue is in terms of marijuana use disorder. And you'll see here there has been a significant increase. So it went from 512,000 to almost 700,000. So that's a very significant increase for youth. And again, I'm really not that surprised given the legalization that is happening across the country. But the important thing to remember is that in no state is marijuana use legal for adolescents. So that's really important. That's a message we need to share with kids. And this is one of the slides that SAMHSA put out. The first couple of bullets the first one deals with pregnancy, but it just looks at all the research on the concerns of marijuana use has on adolescents. So it's been linked to depression, suicide, increased risk for psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, declined IQ. There's really not a lot of good that comes from adolescent marijuana use. And in fact, it's pretty dangerous. So again, as your role as a community leader and working with youth and working with judges and probation and defense attorneys is raising awareness about this. And again, and sometimes the most important people we need to educate are the families and the parents, because first of all, they might say, I smoked it as a kid, or I'm still smoking it now, and I'm smoking it more now because it's legal. Well, that could be a problem, especially because of the example that you're setting for the young people in your life. So I think it's really time, especially given the significant increases we're seeing with marijuana use disorder, that we address this. As I just said, it's illegal in all of the states for adolescents. And as we saw in the previous slide, the increasing evidence base around the dangers of marijuana to the developing brain. This is more facts, and again, this PowerPoint will be available for all of you. So the other point that I wanted to make on this slide is the National Institute of Drug Abuse is also an incredible resource. So you can go to that website, and they have just an incredible amount of information, and a lot of it specifically relating to youth and adolescents. So, just these messages, sharing them, and especially getting kids to see that, contrary to popular belief, marijuana can be addictive, and its use during adolescence may make other forms of problem use or addiction more likely. We've heard about the term gateway drug, and some people like to argue with it, but I think for most of the kids, at least that I've seen on the cases that I work with prosecutors, that, it may have been something that they're dealing with now, but it started with either marijuana or alcohol. So again, these are just important messages and important concepts that we need to know about and to be sharing with our community. Again, these are more statements about that danger, and I think this is something to provide and maybe do a community meeting about. And the Harvard Recovery Research Institute is perhaps my favorite recovery research or favorite research institute, because there's not many recovery research institutes. And it's run by an incredible man by the name of Dr. John Kelly, who had the wisdom back in, I think, 2005 to focus on recovery. Because, again, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, we can spend our time just focusing on the problem, complaining about the problem, or we can look for the solutions. And recovery is the solution for an addiction problem. And so he has spent almost 20 years really creating this immense research base on all aspects of recovery-oriented systems of care. His website is recoveryanswers.org. Again, I have that in the final, the links to resources. But I have to tell you, I go check this several times a week. And the thing I love about the Recovery Research Institute is what they do is they'll post a new study, and they'll also interpret it for you. Because I know when and this was one of the things that happened to me my first time when I was my assistant research professor role at Georgetown. And during that first week, I took out a research paper and I was reading it, and I ran into my colleague's office and I said, "Oh my God, this paper says that diversion, this particular diversion alternative lowered offending." And he looks up and he says, "What was the methodology?" And I just look back, I'm like, I don't even know what that word means, but I went to the last page and I read the conclusion. And I have to admit, sometimes I still do that because I'm really a bottom line kind of person, and a lot of the terms that they use, I mean, I don't know, some of you might have PhDs. I certainly don't have a PhD, but I need a general understanding of what it says, and that's what the Recovery Research Institute provides. It kind of cuts through all the language and says, okay, this is why this study is important. This is how it can be used in a positive way, and that is so critical because we really do need to build some bridges between research and practice, and very, very often we're speaking different languages, and that's not really helpful if we're going to try to implement evidence-based practices and, taking what we're learning in the research and putting it into real life. So these are just some more statements from Harvard. So why are adolescence and early adulthood such risky periods for substance use? And this comes back to what we've learned over the last 20 years about adolescent brain development. So the neuroscience has really been explosive. But sometimes I just think, well, it's sort of confirming what we've known for a very long time, that kids are different than adults. But now we have slides that can prove it, and I always go back to the fact that, juvenile court was created back in 1899. So the fact that we know kids are different, that's not a newsflash. But now we know why, and part of that reason, or the reason is because the brain is not fully developed yet. And so because of that, there's a complex interaction between biological and environmental influences, and they play a big role because, since an adolescent isn't hardwired yet, there's vulnerability to substances, but there's also such an opportunity. And the plasticity of the brain makes it even more possible to infuse people that are struggling, young people that are struggling, with positive peers, positive role models, positive support, positive activities. So the developing brain there's plenty of opportunities, but we also have to understand that the vulnerability of that developing brain to substances is something that we cannot ignore. So this is, and as you can see, I like to just the bottom line on adolescent brain development. The brain continues to develop into a person's 20s. The prefrontal cortex, which is the last part to develop, and that governs reasoning, advanced thought, impulse control, and it's still developing. Now, when the whole concept of adolescent brain development came out, this was just when I was starting in the juvenile justice world, and I attended a conference in D.C., and I went with one of a fellow juvenile court prosecutor who was also an elected prosecutor, Jim Backstrom from Minnesota. And so we went to this meeting where they were, unveiling this new research about the brain and immaturity, and that because of immaturity, adolescents shouldn't be treated, shouldn't be going to adult court, shouldn't be very often held responsible for consequences. And then they talked about, the adolescent brain and said, the adolescent brain, they engage in risky behavior. They don't think of the consequences of their actions. They lie. And I was just sitting there and, again, a little jaded, maybe because I'm from New York, but I looked at Jim Backstrom and I'm like, I just broke up with somebody who does all those things. He lies. He doesn't think of the consequences of his actions. He engages in reckless behavior, and he's no juvenile. So, again, the immaturity argument, yes, it's a general policy, but we also know it depends on the individual, and immaturity doesn't necessarily happen even by the time you're 24. But what we're looking at, again, in juvenile court is making sure that we can hold youth accountable and also try to make that change in their life to promote a more positive outcome. So we know that since the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, that teens naturally are chemically geared to seek greater risks for social, emotional, and physical reasons. And teens are naturally attracted to risky activities. When you think about it, when you throw in alcohol or substances to not, risky activities, risky behavior is the result, and it can be dangerous and can even be deadly. So again, that's why there's so many issues that are created when we're mixing adolescence and substance use issues. So in terms of the key principles of adolescent development, we know that a youth, their development is strongly affected by the interplay between the brain and the environment. So parents, peers, school officials, they have a very strong impact, and community members. And experiences play a critical role in development. And that include, it's both positive and negative experiences. I was talking to you about how, I came from a family that was very inundated with alcoholism. But I had one person who wasn't, and that was my grandmother. And my grandmother was a woman way ahead of her time who, she didn't drink, but she was involved in politics, and she used to take me on conferences to Washington, D.C. So ever since I was a little girl, I was like, oh, I want to grow up and be a lawyer and live in Washington, D.C. She didn't say to me, nobody in our family has ever been a lawyer. Your father didn't even graduate high school. He's a construction worker. She didn't say any of those things, even though they were true, but she told me I could do anything I put my mind to, and I believed her. And so that positive role model had such an impact, because even though I had the genetic predisposition and those other things, the impact that my grandmother had in balancing things out is so powerful. And that's why even when I came into the work of juvenile justice and I saw all this attention on risk factors, which of course they're important, but why aren't we also looking at the protective factors? Because I know just from my own life experiences and what I've seen in actual cases, the importance of looking at those protective factors and enhancing those protective factors. So again, this is that the developing brain is extremely vulnerable to substance dependence, and, you know, shout this from the rooftops because it's not getting out there enough. Another thing we know is that for people with substance use disorders later in life, you know, when they are finally diagnosed with a substance use disorder, 90% of those people started as an adolescent. So that really tells you something right there. So it really is a disease that has its onset in adolescence. So again, so the role of the juvenile court prosecutor in addressing all of these issues is really important. And so whether we're looking at intake, charging, disposition, you know, really making decisions that are based on not only your own court rules, which is very important, but also taking into account what we know about the developing brain, what we know about substance use issues, what we know about the preventable nature of this, and the key to early intervention. Okay. So in terms of prevention, I think this is something that because we now seem to have more time because we're not dealing with as many cases, I think it's really provided a great opportunity for you to get out within your community. Now, obviously, probably not now with COVID, but hopefully when things get back to normal, once again, you'll have a chance to go out in the community and work with the schools and the parents, law enforcement, everybody, because everybody needs to be involved in this. This is an issue that must be addressed at a community level. And one of the projects that I loved, I have a colleague that many of you may know. We did one of our first webinars, is Anthony Piero from Ocean County. He put together this incredible program, and it was really focused on raising awareness on addiction with adolescents. And he had a number of these community forums where they brought together the students, the parents, law enforcement, the teachers, the prosecutors. They even had a DEA agent at this. And I went to one of them and was just so inspired. And they included the students in some of the presentations. And one of the things that I thought was really powerful as well is they had a DEA agent there. And he did a slideshow where he was showing, you know, what the heroin looked like, what the opiate, you know, and things like that. And, you know, he said to the parents and the teachers, I'm not doing this to scare you. You know, I'm trying to educate you, because if you see this in a locker, in a kid, you know, in a bedroom, you know, if your child is hiding it, get it and bring it. We want to get these drugs off the street. And especially now with what we see happening with fentanyl, you know, he said, I'm not interested in arresting you or your kid. The goal now is to get these off the street. So I really think that's really important. And one of the things that when you're talking about prevention programs is you target the predictors. So what some of the things that we do know are that there are certain risk factors that have been identified to increase the risk for addiction, and there's also protective factors that can, again, buffer against it. In terms of the risk factors, genetics is the number one, and gender, males are more at risk. As we learned before, age at first use, the younger a person starts, the greater the likelihood. Some psychological issues can increase your risk. Environmental issues, growing up in a family where there is heavy drug or alcohol use can increase your risks. If you're with peers that use, you're more likely to use. A history of physical or sexual abuse, again, turning to drugs or alcohol to try to cope with it. Something I heard, and this was actually at a recent meeting that I was at, is that genetics load the barrel and environment pulls the trigger. And I just thought that was a really powerful way to look at this. The other thing we know about risk factors is that no single factor is determinative, and most of these risk factors can be modified. But we do know that adolescence and young adulthood are particularly critical at-risk periods. And again, looking at what we know in terms of the protective factors, we know the number one protective factor for a young person is a cancer. So when we look at the risk factors, also making sure that we're balancing out and looking at protective factors. So what are those pro-social things we can do at an individual level, at a social level, and at a community level? Diversion, we've seen a great increase in the number of diversion programs, and that was one of the things I worked on when I was over at Georgetown. And it's really, I think it's a great opportunity because we're able to come up with real creative solutions that evaluate the risk factors and build upon the protective factors. So, and this aligns with that concept of the earlier the intervention, the better the prognosis. So diversion really is an opportunity to address something as early as we can and try not to push somebody further into the system if it's not necessary. One of the things I will note is that according to the NDAA standards, diversion is a charging decision, and we do believe that it should be a charging decision made by a prosecutor. I know that there are some police diversion programs out there, and while I understand that it's based on, the desire of the police departments to help, I do think that it's important to remember that when you have police diversion, you really don't have that incentive that you have with a regular diversion with where you have the potential for a charge. So there is some motivation in that. And I think when young people are trying to stop doing something that provided some enjoyment, they need every reason in the world. And sometimes the thought that this could have a consequence in the justice system can be a good motivator. So that's something I'll say about diversion. And again, I think a referral can be the window of opportunity. A referral to the justice system really does create a willingness to change. And I can tell you that some people look at this as a consequence, and of course it's a consequence. Nobody really wants to go to the justice system. However, there are some positive aspects of a referral to the justice system, and that is it creates that willingness, and willingness is key to changing things. I have never met anybody in a recovery meeting, and I've been going for 19 years. I never met anybody who came to recovery because things were going great. They made the decision because things were going wrong. For myself, I was really lucky. I did not have an arrest. I did not have, I didn't lose my job. In fact, I had gotten a promotion. I made a point of the fact that I didn't have a DWI. That justified my drinking for some time, but then I realized, well, I didn't have a car in New York, so that excuse was really lame. But what I can say is that I've met so many people who started their road to recovery because they either got arrested or had a consequence with the law. So I think it's a really important thing to remember that, some people just view the justice system, any involvement is a bad thing. And I don't see that at all, because I think it is a way, especially now with what we're learning in terms of, being able to use the leverage of the justice system as a powerful force for good. We certainly know that it can be used, the justice system can be used in bad ways, and we want to change that. We, have to realize that the potential for that exists, but what we can do is, in our work, make sure that we are using the leverage of the justice system to turn lives around in a positive way. The National Institute of Drug Abuse recommends that every youth should be screened when they are, come into contact with the justice system. And they also talk about the other problems that are associated with juvenile substance use. So it's increased sexual risk behaviors, violence and accidents, less positive educational, occupational, and psychological outcomes, strongly associated with recidivism among adolescents. And again, and this sort of is what I was just talking about with the last slide, that an encounter with the justice system really has the potential to be a teachable moment. So a lot of time, we hear a lot about screening and assessment, and they're not the same thing. They don't automatically happen. The screening is a more general thing, and here I think these are the best examples where, we've all gone through screening. We go through screening at the airport. And the screening will help us identify who, if anyone, needs a further assessment. So the screening helps to identify the problem, and it's a very easy thing to do. And I have here, there's a lot of great screening tools out there, and I'm thinking most of you are probably using one, but they're really inexpensive, non-invasive, and they can really be a good way to identify those youth who need an assessment and those who don't. So juvenile drug courts and drug treatment courts they've been around for not as long as the adult courts, but the juvenile treatment courts came around after the adult drug courts. But unfortunately, what happened initially, at least from my perspective, is that they really put an adult drug court model on a totally different population. And when I first started doing the work in the juvenile field, I was actually working with a group called Reclaiming Futures, and they had sent me their transition points, and they had, I believe it was 5 key points. And the last point, though, was treatment. And we were on a call, and I said, I don't think you should have the last point as treatment, because we need to be mindful of what happens after treatment. And that was another thing I saw with, holding graduation ceremonies and then saying, okay, you're good, congratulations, you're done. And the reality is, if you're going to treatment, you don't graduate from substance use disorder. You change things, and you have to sustain that change. So I really critiqued that practice, and I was part of a group a few years ago that was brought together to make recommendations as to updated juvenile drug treatment guidelines. And it was very funny, because this was just another opportunity where I was brought in, and I think there was one other practitioner there, but it was primarily researchers. So they break us up into groups. So my little group had me and 5 researchers. And they gave us a bunch of questions, and the first question was, what is best evidence? So we're all sitting there, and I looked at my colleagues, and I said, well, I think we're going to need an interpreter. And they just all looked at me, they're like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, your definition of best evidence is a randomized double-blind control study. My definition of best evidence is a DNA hit or a videotape confession. I said, we just have different interpretations of the same phrase. So we laughed, but we did come up with recommendations, and I'm happy to say that one of my recommendations was to include improving access to positive social connections, because that to me is so important in this work. You know, we talk about changing behavior, and you know, sustained behavior change really is the holy grail of juvenile or adult court. We want to, you know, if there's problem behavior, we want to change it and sustain that change. And so what happens is that we realize the role of peers and the role of community activities and what we're doing, and they have such an important role, especially when we're looking at juvenile drug treatment courts. So what I'm going to talk about now is the recently, so this just came out last month, and it's by somebody who I've worked with who I really admire, Stephen Filippi, and what they did is they took these national guidelines that were issued a couple of years ago, and they translated them into the statewide standards. And this is really important because, you know, things can come out at the national level, and even in the work I do, I always have to be very mindful of the fact that every state has a different juvenile code. Every state has different rules, different deadlines, different procedures. So, you know, I think it's really important when something comes out at the national level that we have stakeholders in the individual states working on this to figure out how to best implement this in a way that's consistent with the policies and procedures of the Juvenile Code of Louisiana. And so far, I think Louisiana is one of the few states that have done this, and I really think it's really important. And the other good news is that with the preliminary results that came out with this, there were positive outcomes, and they've improved the rate of incentives to sanctions, and there's increased. One of the things that they're recommending is community service as part of the disposition or part of the treatment. And, you know, again, so recognizing that, you know, it's nice to get guidance from above and guidance from the feds, but also recognizing that if you really want to have this have an impact in your community, it's very important to, you know, translate it and make it work and align it with your rules and procedures. When we talk about adolescent substance abuse treatment, there's many factors involved, and there's no one size fits all. And the thing is, and this I think is pretty exciting as well, is that we're recognizing that the need of treatment can be a condition. It can be a condition of diversion. It can be a treatment court, or it can be a disposition condition. So one of the things I've always thought as well is that, you know, when we have an encounter with a youth, if we see that there is problematic substance use going on, let's not wait until they're eligible for the treatment court, because very often in most states the treatment courts are for the more serious offenders with the more serious substance use problems. And again, so if we have diversion opportunities where we can address this and say, you know what, maybe connecting them to some motivational interviewing or 12-step facilitation, things like that, before the problem gets even worse. And another great initiative that's out there is the ESPERT initiative, and Anthony and I did a pilot of this in New Jersey with the school resource officers, because very often those school resource officers have real relationships with the kids in the schools, and, you know, they are sometimes confidants. And so to educate the school resource officers on, again, the things that we're talking about today, and then training them on motivational interviewing and ways that they can talk to kids, help to identify problems and then make the connections that are necessary to resolve those problems. The other thing I'll note that's not on here, but I have worked with a number of courts that have incorporated, and it's mindfulness and meditation and even yoga. And I first heard that it was actually a prosecutor up in Cape Cod who was using some of his drug forfeiture money to pay for meditation classes in elementary school. And from the moment I heard it, I was like, that is brilliant. Because what we know from the science about mindfulness and breathing is that it decreases the stress in our central nervous system, and it promotes relaxation. And he sees, the reason that he was doing this is it's a primary method of prevention, because, you know, and I look at myself that one of the reasons that I drank, well, I drank because I like to drink, but I also used it to take the edge off. And I can tell you that meditation has been very key to my sobriety, because it really does take that edge off, and it really does calm the central nervous system. And for young people to be able to access that and to be able to, by their own breathing, you know, calm things down, especially for kids who are growing up in environments where there's domestic violence, where there's, you know, conditions that are just chaotic, where we're giving them real life tools to say, you know what, this will help you. It may not solve the external problem, but it's giving kids some access to something they can do 24/7. So perhaps the thing I'm most excited about in this field right now is the shift that's underway, and the fact that recovery is fast becoming the prevailing paradigm in the field. As I said earlier, historically, the focus had been on treatment. It was a very acute care model. We sent you to treatment. You left treatment. There was a whole mantra out there, treatment works. Well, I think we have all probably known somebody in our lives that went to treatment and treatment didn't work. And treatment, unfortunately, became sort of a revolving door. And because of that, and because of what we've learned about addiction as preventable yet potentially chronic, we realized we needed to expand the lens on how we looked at this issue. So now we're looking at things from the much broader perspective of a recovery-oriented system of care. I should probably just get a T-shirt or a tattoo. Preventable, early the intervention, the better the prognosis, and recovery support, because those three ideals are really critical to the work we're doing and are really responsible for some really innovative programs. Now, the Recovery Research Institute, this is what I told you about earlier. There's the link to the website. Again, coming across this work and meeting John Kelly, who, again, that statement that he made on December 10th, 2010, that the criminal justice system can provide the motivational fulcrum for recovery, that was a turning point in my life, because it just resonated on such a deep level. And I was like, this is what I want to work on. I want to work on doing all we can to motivate people to change for the better and sustain that change. And it was a couple of years ago, actually, I came across, we were learning so much about addiction, and, you know, some were calling it a disease, some were calling it a condition. I was like, all I know is I had it. I have it, but I don't drink anymore, so I'm very happy. And suddenly there were a lot of advocates out there saying, you know, you can't arrest people for their addiction. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. And, you know, addiction is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. And while addiction is very similar to other disorders like cancer and diabetes and heart disease, you know, there are some similarities, but none of those diseases correlate with criminal offending, and addiction does. and substance use. Actually, Ed Mulvey from the University of Pennsylvania found in one of his studies, substance use drives offending. So to have it as a get out of jail free card makes no sense. So a few years ago, I wrote this paper, Love, Hope, and Random Drug Testing, because it really is about using that leverage in a positive way. And during the time that I was writing that paper, I came across some really incredible research that was out there. One of the researchers was Professor Jim McKay from the University of Pennsylvania, and he talked about the fact that one of the reasons that treatment was becoming a revolving door is that, treatment was doing a good job of taking away the drugs and the alcohol, but they weren't filling the void that was created. And if you don't, fill that void and give people a reason to believe that staying abstinent is worth it, that it's worth the struggle, then they're going to go back to it. And I was like, exactly. And, again, this research resonated with me on a personal level. I know that when I went into my first meeting, I raised my hand. I said I was an alcoholic. I was hysterical crying, but I also felt a sense of relief, and I also believed, okay, I put the truth out there, and then I listened to other stories of people sharing in the room that night, and these were people, they were telling stories, they drank the same way I drank, and now they weren't drinking, and they were happy. And it just ignited this little glimmer of hope in me that, like, maybe I can do this. Maybe, just maybe. And that's where I believe that hope is, Dr. Bernie Siegel talks about hope being the divine motivator. And so we have to really recognize just how important concepts like hope and love are. And, drug testing and monitoring, they're important, and they're holding people responsible, and that can help to sustain things as well, because people need reasons to stay sober. But we also have to recognize that they're not enough. If we want to sustain long-term behavior change, we have to connect people with things that bring them love, bring them hope, bring them meaning and purpose. And that's how you sustain that behavior change. So this is my Bible, and it was written by Dr. John Kelly and William White, who is one of really the greatest historian on recovery in the country, and I highly recommend checking out his work as well. You can Google William White Papers, and just this book really has so much incredible information in it, and it does talk about adolescent recovery. It talks about a number of different really important principles of recovery-oriented systems of care. One of those concepts is recovery capital, and this has been something that it's actually pretty funny, because when I first met John Kelly, we had coffee, and I said, John, I think it's amazing that you have this center that studies recovery, but I know that my own recovery was a miracle, because I drank for, so many years. Basically, since I started drinking, I drank alcoholically, and I knew I had a problem for a long time, but I didn't want to address it. And then I went to a meeting, and I haven't had a drink since my first meeting. That's a miracle. And he was very polite, and he smiled at me, and he said, well, Susan, it may have been a miracle, or you may have very high recovery capital. And I was like, what the heck is recovery capital? So then I started, because I didn't want to tell him I didn't know what it was. So, of course, then I start researching. And I'm like, oh, my God, he measured my miracle. And this concept of recovery capital, I truly think, is going to change so much for the positive in the justice system. So recovery capital is basically your strengths and assets at the personal, social, and community levels. And, you know, in my own life, I was lucky personally. I had a very gritty personality. I was resilient, and socially, I was very fortunate when I made the decision to get sober that I had the support, wholehearted support of my family, my friends. Even had a lot of friends who were like, I drink as much as you do. Well, you know, how can you have a problem? I'm like, well, I don't know, maybe you want to look at it. I also was very fortunate because within the community, I was living in New York City, I had access to 12-step meetings 24/7. So, and I'm really excited because I'm currently working on a project to bring the concept of recovery capital into juvenile treatment courts. And working with Professor Emily Hennessy, who is absolutely amazing, and she is an expert in recovery capital for adolescents. So I've included a screenshot with her study, her paper, and then it's also, I have a link to it at the end of this. And we'll have more announcements about this project that we're going to be doing with NADCP, but it's really interesting to be looking at the concept of recovery capital for adolescents, looking at assets, looking at enhancing those assets, and then also addressing the barriers. And we know that peers play such a huge role in the life of an adolescent. And we also know that negative peer, you know, deviant peers, drug-using peers, that is something that we have to change. So a big concept in adolescent recovery is the concept of alternative peer groups. And this has taken hold in a lot of states. I know Texas is at the forefront of this. So it's really about removing the negative peers and replacing with more positive peers, positive activities. These groups facilitate 12-step meetings, pro-social activities, family support, educational opportunities, and just really a dynamic way. You know, and the other part is that young people want to have fun. And having them understand and coming together and having fun without the, and understanding that they don't need the drugs and alcohol to have fun. So this is a really exciting component of recovery for adolescents. And again, as we have more information about the project we're going to be working on, I'll be sharing it hopefully with all of you. And this paper I came across recently, and it's about love and service in adolescent addiction recovery. And, you know, I think some people get a little nervous with talking about love and service. And quite frankly, if you had told me 30 years ago when I was in the Manhattan DA's office that I'd be doing a national webinar talking about the importance of love and service, I'd probably like roll my eyes or laugh in your face. But it's because I've experienced these things through my own recovery that I realize how important and how critical they are. And the concepts of love and service have the support of research. And one of my favorite researchers in the world is a man named George Valiant, and he did an incredible study, the Harvard Grant study, where they looked, it's a longitudinal study where they looked at the lifetime, really, of two groups of men in the Boston area. And one of the major findings from that study is that, and they started from, you know, their youth up until their 80s. And one of the major takeaways of that study was that for those people who had problems with alcohol, those men in the study, the best treatment for them was AA. It wasn't medication. It wasn't hospitalization. It was AA. And George Valiant continued to write about those findings, and he wrote a book where he talked about the transformative power of positive emotions. And that was another one of those moments where it just resonated with my soul, because I know that that's what I found in recovery. And that's what this can provide. Now, we know that AA is not for everyone. but there are certainly a lot of people who do benefit from it. And in fact, this past March, John Kelly released a truly groundbreaking study that confirmed the efficacy of AA, and talking about that AA is basically the closest thing to free lunch that the public health system will ever have, and that it's more effective than treatment, that it's available basically in almost every community across the country and internationally. So I think it's really important that we look at the different opportunities to support addiction recovery, and this study was talking about just how important the concepts of AA can be in terms of dealing with both the substance use and reducing the criminal offending. And I also work with a professor, David Best, who's a criminologist, and he looks at the parallels between recovery from addiction and desistance from offending. And very often, both of those processes require changing inside and out. So changing the way we think, changing the way we act, changing the people we associate with, changing the activities we engage in. So there's a lot of overlap here. This is another study that came out recently, and it's the Volunteer Recovery Support for Adolescent approach. And in this project, the volunteers were trained and supervised to provide recovery, monitoring, and support for adolescents after discharge from treatment. And at its heart, it focused on adolescents helping to increase time spent with peers who were supportive of recovery and increase participation in recovery-focused activities. So again, so much of this is about connections. One of the things, and this has been from a lot of the life course research on offending, is we know that crime is less likely to occur when social bonds are strong. And it's very similar to addiction because, as we know, addiction can really be a disease of isolation. So when we're increasing connections, increasing that positive support and positive sense of identity, we can have an impact on both offending and on substance use. The last study that I'd like to mention is the Iceland Youth Study, and this was several years ago, but it was really significant, and I've seen it in the media lately. So, and to me, it makes all the sense in the world. So Iceland was having significant problems with adolescent substance use issues. And so what they did is they developed a program that targeted peer influence, parental supervision, and monitoring, and promoting healthy activities within the community, including sports activities, arts, nature, things like that. They reduced adolescent substance use by approximately 60%. So I know that was a lot of material, and I know that, there's a lot here. So just in terms of giving you what I believe are the most important takeaway points from today's presentation, that adolescents are particularly vulnerable to the impact of drugs and alcohol. Prevention and early intervention are absolutely critical for this population. And for those with more severe substance use issues, what happens after treatment can be just as important or more important than what happens during treatment. We also know we have to change the message. The whole idea of it being a harmless rite of passage is not only untrue, but it's dangerous. So given what we know about the vulnerability of the developing brain and the chronic nature and potential deadly nature of this condition, we need to change this message, and you need to get this across to everyone you're working with. Again, you can use that Surgeon General's report to provide the facts, and it's an incredible resource. Again, I truly believe in my heart and my soul that a referral to the justice system is an opportunity to make a difference in a young person's life. It's one of the reasons I really segued from the adult system to working in the juvenile justice system, because, we hear so much about second chances and people, coming out of the adult system and pardons and things like that. And it's like, well, what if we got it right the first time? What if we addressed the issue in a way that actually was able to change the trajectory for this young person? And we're not going to do that if we ignore it, but if we can use that referral as an opportunity to make those changes that will help a young person turn their life around, just think of the potential. And finally, September is Recovery Month, so I also wanted to make one final message to all of you, because I know that we are living in such stressful and unprecedented times, and working in the justice system right now is incredibly stressful. So I came across this the other day, and I thought it was so beautiful, so I wanted to share with all of you, because I'm putting this in a frame above my desk, and I think we can all use some positive messages. So this one, he said, in the midst of hate, I found there was within me an invincible love. In the midst of tears, I found there was within me an invincible smile. In the midst of chaos, I found there was within me an invincible calm. I realized through it all that in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. And that makes me happy. For it says that no matter how hard the world pushes against me, within me, there's something stronger, something better, pushing right back. I just love that, and I hope if any of you related to it and want to put it above your desk to provide some support, I hope it helps. And so now I know that people have submitted questions, so we'll start with those, and then we'll open it up for more questions. So I realized that that was quite a long presentation, and I've spoken on this before, but today's presentation, there was a lot of information, and one of the things that we realized as we were preparing and we were getting all the registrations and all the questions and all the different just issues that you guys are dealing with, we realized that it's probably wise to make a series out of this, because there's so many different facets to substance use disorders and adolescents. So what we're going to be doing is creating a series, and I've already reached out to one of the top experts on marijuana use. So we're going to be setting up a webinar for him to talk about marijuana use and adolescents, and also a lot of different issues that were mentioned in your registrations in terms of mental health and family resources and equitable access to treatment. And so we're going to cover all those things. So I would also say, when you're filling out your surveys, if you want to add in there any other topics that you would like us to cover in the series, that would be great. And so I just want to respond to a couple of the questions that came up. I know that somebody asked about on data regarding the percentage of people who successfully recover from meth addiction. And I do not have that information at my fingertips, but I recently have been connected with one of the leading experts on meth addiction and use, and so she's at UCLA, and I will get an answer from her on that. I know somebody else asked about the stat regarding increased risk based on using before the age of 15, and that study particularly was around alcohol. So I don't know for sure if it applies to the other substances, but I will check with John Kelly. I imagine based on the whole developing brain aspect it would, but again, we'll talk about that, and I'll get the answer to that in one of the upcoming questions and series. And we answered the question about the book, and let's see here. Oh, somebody was asking, and I think it was LaShawn from DC, about resources for family therapy, and that is obviously so important. And I know that one of your colleagues talked about MST, so we know there's multi-systemic therapy out there, family functional therapy. I think one of the things that's really important at a community level is to really go into your community and do an inventory of, what you actually have, because very often there are services within your community that you're not even aware of. And the professor, David Best, and I are putting together a project where we talk about asset-based community development. And that's one of the things is you do the inventory, you find out who those resources are, and you all start working together as a team, because it's such a multifaceted problem that nobody can do this alone. So it's really important that you're reaching out to others within your community, because you all have to be working together on this. And I see, somebody just mentioned something about harm reduction, which again, there's many pathways to recovery, and harm reduction is obviously one of, and that's sort of on the road to recovery, because harm reduction with some people can still lead to, accessing services and unfortunately overdosing, and because when you're continuing the use, especially with opioids, because of the risk of fentanyl, or even with cocaine and things like that. So again, there's many pathways to recovery, and we can talk about that topic in another one of the many series. I have a feeling that there are going to be a lot more webinars coming up on this. So again, somebody asked about the link to Recovery Research Institute and its Recovery Answers, and there's a lot of links at the end, and I've included a number of the studies that I referenced. And yes, so one of the things, I just see a question on AA having virtual options, use specific groups. They do, and let me put in here, so young people in recovery, it's amazing to me how many young people are getting sober. It's wonderful. So let me write that in, young people in recovery. I would just, you know what, I'm having a problem here as I'm trying to talk and get this to you. They are an amazing group, and I mean, primarily a lot of their work is focused on collegiate recovery, but there's also the Association of Higher Education, and they do have, what's amazing is there's now recovery high schools out there, and the links for virtual AA, you can really go to, I think you just go to aa.org. Most of AA is now happening virtually. I know a few in-person meetings are happening again, but it's definitely, it's going to depend on the jurisdiction. So aa.org would be a resource, and that's probably the best. And so we have 1 minute left, so I just really want to take the time. Thank you all for joining us today. This is an issue near and dear to my heart, and I truly, truly, truly believe that we have tremendous opportunities right now to address things earlier, even prevent a lot of kids from going down this road, because, it's not a harmless rite of passage. It's actually a harmful and potentially deadly passage. So I think it's really important to get that message out. And I will close now. I don't know if NTAC has any closing remarks as well.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Great presentation. And just a couple of quick announcements before we formally close the webinar. We do have a couple of resources slides that were mentioned here throughout the presentation, so please take a look to access those resources on the slides here. Also, just a quick reminder to please take the online evaluation, and as Susan mentioned, provide your feedback for what you want to see in upcoming events. We're very interested in helping the field with these sorts of topics, so please let us know what you're interested in or want more information on. Finally, some contact information. If you have questions about today's webinar, you want some of the resources, you can do so by contacting the OJJDP's NTAC. The website is on the slide here. We also have a TTA Help Desk that you can contact via the phone number or email address If you're interested in further events, you can sign up for the OJJDP JUVJUS. Finally, we want to make you aware of our TTA 360 platform. If you have a training or technical assistance need, you can quickly submit a request through the platform through the link on the slide here. And again, we did record this webinar. It will be on Intact's YouTube page, and we also have other great webinars with a lot of information on there if you're interested in additional juvenile justice and child victimization prevention topics. Finally, we ask you please review the attribution and disclaimer slide that's displayed on your screen here. And we do have a couple of upcoming events that may be of interest to some of you. These are prosecutor-related events, so please take a moment to review the more information and register now if you're interested in attending. We have a couple with Zero Abuse Project. And we also have a couple more coming up in October with Western Regional Children's Advocacy Center, and again, another one with Zero Abuse Project. So we do have one final poll question for you before we let you go. If you could please just let us know, how are you anticipating using the information from today's webinar in your work? We'll go ahead and open that up, and you can select multiple choice here, so feel free to select more than one if you're using it in multiple ways. And again, we'd like to thank you for attending today. We hope you have a nice afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.
The host has left the meeting, so at this time, the meeting will come to an end. Thank you and goodbye.